As authors, how do we craft that can't put down, binge-worthy, page-turning story that will keep our readers coming back for more, that will hook them from the first page to the last page? We're talking suspense on this episode of The Creator's Journey. We've all been there, right? We're sitting, we're watching a movie. The lights are dark in our house. And the head cheerleader is making out in her bedroom with her boyfriend when all of a sudden the lights go off in the house. And then there's a noise. And the cheerleader gets up from the bed, tells her boyfriend she'll be back in a moment, and then leaves. And we watch as the cheerleader walks down the stairs and through the hall and down the room with the camera right behind her. And then she reaches for the basement door and slowly turns the knob. I think we all know what happens next. But yet we fall for it every single time, right? We've seen this in Scream and in every slasher film since the 1970s, I think. And that's suspense. We know what's coming, but we fall for it every time. Suspense is one of the best ways that we can hook a reader and keep them on the roller coaster of our story straight through to the final page. And if we do our jobs well, we can get them to come back for the second book in the series, or the third book, and the fifth, and the 10th. So suspense is very important to the writing process, even if you're not a suspense writer. Your story could have suspenseful elements in it that will hook the reader and make them want to turn the page. So let's talk about some elements of suspense. The first most important element of suspense is your protagonist. It's your hero. It's the character. You have got to create an interesting, relatable character. Now, notice, I didn't say that you had to create a likable character, but they had to be interesting and relatable. This is the most important thing because the reader has to care what happens to the character. You can build all the suspense in the world, but if the reader doesn't care about your characters, they don't care. A great example of this would be David Eddings. And David Eddings is one of my favorite authors. He wrote the Malloreon and the Millennium and a whole bunch of other books. And his plots, well, truthfully, they were very simplistic. And you could see what was coming a mile away. But the characters that he drew, the characters he created, the relationships between those characters were so true and so real that I kept reading each and every book because I loved the relationships and I became invested in those characters. So the first element of suspense that you've got to get down is creating a relatable, interesting character. Once you got that character, well, then really the sky's the limit. You can create suspense in a many multitude of ways. Okay? So let's discuss some of them right now. The first way you can create suspense is by letting the reader know more than the hero. Let the reader know everything that's going on in the story. But don't tell your main character. Let's say you were writing a story about a man whose wife was brutally murdered, and you start from the man's discovery on page 1. There's no suspense. That's where the story starts. You can say at that point that the story is going to be a mystery of the man trying to solve his wife's murder. But let's just say for a moment that the chapter before the man discovers his wife was murdered, you show the wife being murdered. Hey, you might even show the murderer being the man's best friend, the man's business partner, the woman's father, whoever it's going to be. Then we all know the wife is dead. And we are in anticipation of seeing what the response from the husband will be. You just created suspense. Because we know what happens, and we're anxious to find out what the character's, what the hero's response is going to be. So a great way of developing suspense would be to tell your reader more than you tell your hero. Now, the second way you create suspense is exactly the opposite of that. You don't tell your reader anything more than your hero knows. And you take them on the journey as if they're sitting on your protagonist's shoulder. And they go through all the hoops that the hero goes through at the same time that they're going through. Now, admittedly, this is going to be a more challenging road. And this is why drawing interesting characters that are relatable, and in this case, likable, is so important. It's also important at this point, in my opinion, to have a well-crafted novel, so you know each and every beat that you're going to hit. In this case, if you're going to use this strategy for creating suspense, you have to be a planner, not a pantser. Now, you may be a plantser, might be able to get away with it, but I would recommend that you only use this method. The reader knows only what the protagonist knows, only what the hero knows, if you are a planner. If you're a pantser or a plantser, you may want to move on from this. Suspense could also be created by using constraints of time and raising the stakes. If you write a story where a man has to get out of the room, but the room has a refrigerator, full electricity, cable television, a PS4, an iPad, a fully functioning Keurig, hey, I love coffee, then that's not a very interesting story. But if you write a story where a man is in a locked room and he needs to get out, and it's dark because there is no electricity, and it's damp and dank, and there's only enough oxygen left for 5 minutes. Now that's suspenseful. If the man is locked in the room and he needs to get out because a bomb is going to go off in the city, or he's locked in the room and he needs to get out because the kidnapper is going to kill his wife, now that's suspenseful. An old writing teacher of mine in college told me that the perfect story followed this formula. Get your protagonist stuck in a tree, throw rocks at him, get him out of the tree. Suspense are the rocks. As many rocks as you can throw at a person by using time constraints, by using puzzles, by using physical danger, emotional danger, mental danger, spiritual danger, anything that endangers the life of your hero is going to build suspense. So think about how you can really mess with your hero. And as I said, it doesn't have to be a suspense novel. I don't write suspense novels. I'm currently in the middle of writing a mystery. I also have a piece of coming-age erotica out, and I'm also toying with a science fiction fantasy book. None of them are suspense-based, yet all of them have these elements of suspense. One of my favorite authors, Dan Brown, uses puzzles and time as a way to build suspense. You've got to solve the puzzle, right? Robert Langdon and Sophie, or whoever he's with in the other novels, have to solve the puzzles in a specific period of time and also in a specific order to prevent a catastrophe from happening. This builds the suspense. Will the hero solve the puzzle? Will he solve it in time? Will he get to the next location? Right? All these things use time as the main element in creating suspense. If there's an element of future danger, that creates suspense. Another way you can create suspense is with a surprise. Now, a normal surprise, like man comes home, people jump out behind the couch and wish him happy birthday, that's not very suspenseful, right? Although it might be. Here's a challenge for you. Think about some of the ways you can turn an ordinary surprise party and make it suspenseful. You can choose to play with this idea from the point of view of the man entering into the surprise party, or you can choose to play with this from the point of view of one of the guests hiding behind the man's couch. I'd be interested in seeing what you come up with if you decide to take me up on this challenge. So please do me a favor. Leave your ideas in the comments below. I want to see exactly what you come up with. Now, we've been talking about concepts and ideas on how to put suspense into your writing, on how to build that suspense. So now, let's talk about some of the practical ways that you can do that. Because you may be sitting out there going, well, Gary, those are great ideas, but how the hell do I do it? So let's discuss a couple of them. You can build suspense at the beginnings of chapters by dropping an interesting factoid, which will get the reader's mind turning on how is this going to come into play in the story. You can pose a question at the beginning of your chapter. Now, the great thing about questions is that once asked, the brain has to answer it. It has to. So if you ask a question, and of course put it in the context of your story, but when you ask that question, the brain is immediately going to seek out information to answer it. That is going to build a natural amount of suspense in the reader without even diving into plot, character, and story arc. So that's a real good one. Start your chapter, or at the beginning of a chapter, ask a question. Have the main character ask the question, either to someone else or through inner dialogue. Or I guess some people call it inner monologue, which also is another great practical tip for building suspense. Remember, you build a character that people find interesting and can relate to. If we hear what's going on in their thoughts, through the use of an inner monologue, if we hear their stress, their anxiety, their fear, that will build the suspense for whatever they're going through. So, for example, let's go back to the example I used earlier with the man whose wife was brutally murdered. We know she's murdered. he may be walking up to the house, and we could hear in his inner dialogue that he is so happy to be home because it's been a long work trip, and he's looking forward to doing nothing but spending time with his beautiful new bride. Well, okay, that's going to build suspense even more. So the use of an inner monologue is really important and a great practical way you can build suspense. Another great way you could build suspense are cliffhangers, right? TV's been doing this for years. Build a cliffhanger. Put your protagonist, your hero, in a situation that is perilous, either mentally, spiritually, emotionally, or physically perilous to him. Build the scene up to the climax, but then don't pay it off until the next chapter. And don't pay it off immediately. Let the reader sit and stew. This will heighten the experience of the suspense. Now, we talked about earlier how time can be used for suspense, to build suspense. And the great thing about time is it can be manipulated in several ways. You can create a flashback or a flash forward that will help build the suspense in your current present state. Imagine, if you will, let's go back to the poor man whose wife keeps getting brutally murdered. Let's say for a moment that before the man discovers his wife is brutally murdered, we have a flashback of when they met and how romantic it was. Or perhaps how they didn't hit it off. How much more are we going to feel for that husband as he's walking down the road, walking up his driveway, and about to open up his front door to find his wife brutally murdered? Or maybe we flash forward to where the man is now chief of police, when before he was a sanitation worker. Well, how'd he get there? We want to know. What was on the journey? So using time in flashbacks and flash forwards is an excellent way of building suspense, because you leak out parts of the story to your reader. Parts of the story giving them information that the main character does not have. Now, you could always use time practically as well. Let's say you're trapped in that room again, that dark, dank room with only 5 minutes of oxygen. Well, now while exploring the room, the man hits a button and the walls start to close. Or perhaps he hits a button and the oxygen level goes from 5 minutes left to 2 minutes left. You just compressed time and you made the situation more urgent. Therefore, you've got more suspense. Now, you can even play with that idea by building in reprises. Really take your reader on the roller coaster, where the man stuck in the room with 5 minutes of oxygen may find a breathing apparatus that allows him to double the amount of time to 10 minutes. And then somewhere along the line, that breathing apparatus breaks and time has still continued to move, so now he only has 2 minutes. So you can really play with the emotions of your reader and build the suspense in waves by using time. Another great tip for building suspense is to build parallel tracks. Instead of just having one main plot, split your plots between two main characters, the antagonist and the protagonist. And then the reader can get the point of view from what the protagonist is doing and what the antagonist is doing, and can watch the two trains going on their separate tracks headed for collision. Think about it. Batman becomes much more interesting when we can follow the story of Joker and see what he's plotting. We gain an anticipation or a suspense for the climax. We need to see it because we want to see how it's going to turn out. So building parallel tracks, an antagonist main plot and a protagonist main plot, a hero and a villain, is another great way of building suspense. Now, on a personal note, I want to let you know, because what I've shared with you so far are wonderful practical ideas and conceptual ideas on what suspense is and how we could utilize suspense and somewhat of what it does to the reader. But really, what it boils down to is that creating suspenseful elements is a promise you are making to your reader. Whether you are giving them more information than the hero knows, or you're building a puzzle that they have to solve, or they are watching the protagonist solve, whether they are reading about a man who is about to discover his wife was brutally murdered, or a man stuck in a locked room with 5 minutes of oxygen. All of these things are promises that you are making to your reader. And you have to make sure that you pay them off. This is another reason I say that to work with suspense, it's helpful if you're a planner or at least a plantser. Because you have to pay off the promise that you made to the reader. Right? Anton Chekhov, wonderful Russian, I was going to say poet, but he's a playwright. Anton Chekhov once said, and he was talking about foreshadowing at the time, he once said, if there is a rifle hanging above the fireplace in Act 1, that gun must go off before the end of the play. Does that make sense? It's the same thing with suspense. If you are showing how the husband met his beautiful new young bride and their relationship, and you're showing him walking up the driveway and how the leaves are crackling under his feet and how the gravel is crunching under his shoes in a very evil way. And then he opens the door and the wife is sitting there wearing nothing but a smile, you have failed your reader. The most important thing to remember about suspense is that it is a promise you make to your reader. You must pay off the promise. Well, folks, that's my thoughts on suspense. I hope that you found them valuable. I hope that you will use them in your writing. Please do me a favor. Remember that example I just used earlier where I gave you the challenge of the surprise party? I really want to know what you did with that. So please, do me a favor. Leave them in the comments. Tell me how you made that surprise party more suspenseful. You don't have to write the entire story or even a paragraph. Just give me a general ballpark of what your idea on that was. And hey, if you want to use that as a writing prompt, and that spurs you to write a great scene or a great story about suspense, rock on, that's cool too. And please, if you like what you're hearing right now, if you want to follow me, do me a favor, click the like button, click the subscribe button. I think the subscribe is over here. I always get this wrong. It's on one of these sides down here. Give me a thumbs up, give me a like, ring the bell, subscribe to my channel. I try to do this every couple of weeks, put up a video. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been a little lax. But I promise to get back on schedule. I want to thank Robert for asking me to participate in word stock 2, because this really kicked me in my ass and forced me to get back in front of the camera and start filming again, and that's what I needed. So hopefully you'll see more videos coming up in the near future. But until the next time, I'm Gary, and this has been The Creator's Journey.